Hello, I'm Brad Kelly, and you're listening to Method and Madness. This is a show about books, the people who write them, and the labyrinth to be explored between the words.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had his band. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had.
Hey everybody, so if you've never listened to a Madness episode because they're normally behind the paywall, this is what they're like. It's really the second part of a series talking about a particular book. And in this case, the first part is behind the paywall, and the second part, which is normally behind the paywall, is free for everybody. How these episodes go is they're not, strictly speaking, a conversation directly about the book. I tend to stray away from kind of English majory type analyses of the book's content and what the author meant and all of that. And instead, this is an exploration of the many rabbit holes that pop up for me specifically while I read the book. And I hope this sort of tour of subjects is interesting to you. It's not that it's not about the book, it's about things around the book. And as the intro to every episode of this podcast says, the labyrinth between the words. So we might get psychological, we might get scientific, we'll definitely get historical. We might even apply some literary theory if it makes sense. We'll get into the strange, the esoteric, the occult, and the autre, and I hope you enjoy it. If you do, why not sign up for a paid subscription and check out some of the other Madness episodes out there. Thanks, and enjoy.
So I did the research. I started the research on hoodoo at the Los Angeles Library, and that was the beginning of it. It involves prophecy, and it involves conjuring, and it involves dance, and it involves mystery, and it involves painting, and it involves sculpture, and all the arts. It was like multimedia. And these rites were practiced in New Orleans, in our country, in the 19th century. And I began reading material on this, and I found we had a gold mine, and I've continued getting into it, learning French, for example, and trying to read everything I can put my hands on, because I think you can understand it when you talk about maybe Yeats and some of the Irish poets trying to bring back their mythology. I think if you go into a people's past and see what's consistent in their art, you can find their mind.
So for years, I've been hearing, kind of at the edges of my research into things like Hermeticism and the tarot, about this so-called Book of Thoth. It's a name held in common with Aleister Crowley's tarot deck, as you may know, and it serves as the MacGuffin in Ishmael Reed's MUMBO JUMBO. A MacGuffin, for people who don't know, this is just a term that writers use to refer to an object of surpassing importance, the acquisition and loss of which drives the plot. The name derives from a particular model of briefcase, which I think was first used by Alfred Hitchcock in a film. In the lore of Mumbo Jumbo, the Book of Thoth is a secret text that has long been held by the Knights Templar, and which carries essentially the ancient mystical choreography of Osiris. It's also the thing which the anti-plague of Jess Grew is seeking in the 1920s New York City. I thought it might be cool to dig into the Book of Thoth, what it's supposed to be, what it actually might be, and where it came from. So the first is, what is the Book of Thoth? Well, to answer that question, we need to get some additional context. The first thing worth knowing about all of this is that in ancient Egypt, pseudographia was commonplace, and thus the god Thoth essentially wrote all the books in that time and place. Well, here is from the aforementioned Aleister Crowley in the book-length essay that supplements his tarot deck. Quote, "The principal characteristic of Tahuti, or Thoth, the Egyptian Mercury, is firstly that he has the head of the ibis. The ibis is the symbol of concentration because it was supposed that this bird stood continuously upon one leg, motionless. This is quite evidently a symbol of the meditative spirit. There may have also been some reference to the central mystery of the Aeon of Osiris, the secret guarded so carefully from the profane that the intervention of the male was necessary to the production of children. In this form of Thoth, he is seen bearing the phoenix wand, symbolizing resurrection through the generative process. In his left hand is the Ankh, which represents a sandal strap, that is to say, the means of progress through the worlds, which is the distinguishing mark of Godhead. But by its shape, this Ankh, Crux ansata, is actually another form of the rose and cross, and this fact is perhaps not quite such an accident as modern Egyptologists, preoccupied with their attempted refutation of the phallic school of archaeology, would have us suppose. End quote. Thoth is essentially the Egyptian god associated with the moon, wisdom, knowledge, hieroglyphics, writing, science, magic, and art. He is associated with and most often depicted as an ibis-headed man, but he is also associated with the baboon. Now on to his book. If Thoth effectively wrote all of the Egyptian texts, and there are countless ancient Egyptian texts to choose from, what is the significance of a single text that we might call it the Book of Thoth? Apparently, the legend of such a thing can be traced back to a particular papyrus, number 30646 in the Cairo Museum. The story included there goes like this. Long ago, there was a prince named Na-Nefer-Kapta. He was obsessed with reading the writings on the tombs of the pharaohs and on the stela of the House of Life. More on the House of Life in a bit. An old priest saw what he was doing and told him, quote, "You are reading writings that have no importance for anyone. If you desire to read writings, come to me, and I'll have you taken to the place where that book is that Thoth wrote with his own hand when he came down following the other gods. 2 spells are written in it. When you recite the first spell, you will charm the sky, the earth, the netherworld, the mountains and the waters. You will discover what all the birds of the sky and all the reptiles are saying. You will see the fish of the deep, though there are 21 divine cubits of water over them. When you recite the second spell, it will happen that, whether you are in the netherworld or in your form on earth, you will see Pre appearing in the sky with his Ennead and the moon in its form of rising." End quote. Now, Nefer-Kapta very much wanted to see this book, and he paid 10 pieces of silver for the privilege. But the old priest told him, quote, "The book in question is in the middle of the water of Koptos in a box of iron. In the box of iron is a box of copper. In the box of copper is a box of juniper wood. In the box of juniper wood is a box of ivory and ebony. In the box of ivory and ebony is a box of silver. In the box of silver is a box of gold, and in it is the book. There are 6 miles of serpents, scorpions, and all kinds of reptiles around the box in which the book is, and there is an eternal serpent around this same box." End quote. Now here's from Mumbo Jumbo. Quote, "We deciphered this to mean that the book was buried beneath the center of the Cotton Club, the nightclub where Abdul had been arrested for loitering and for attacking the flappers. The night he was arrested, he apparently had just finished hiding the sacred book there. He translated the book before he died, and a copy of this translation was in the hands of a publisher who rejected the book, but the original treasure was safe underneath the Cotton Club. When we dug up the box containing the book, we found the Templar seal on the top, and we traced it to Hinkle von Vampton, as the scout the Wallflower Order of the Atenus Path had assigned to create a talking android. The second phase of the Wallflower plan, that of creating a spokesman who would furtively work to prepare the new Negro to resist Just Grew and not catch it. It was the seal on the box of the book that connected us with Hinkle von Vampton, and if you will just look, he is wearing it right now." End quote. So, Nefer-Kapta goes to Koptos in the original papyrus. He charms the Isis cult there, and he fabricates a boat and rowers from wax, and he rows out and finds the book. He acquires the magic within it, charming the sky, the earth, the netherworld, the mountains, and the water. He is able to speak with the birds of the sky and the fish of the deep and the beasts of the desert. The book contained incredibly powerful magic, but Nefer-Kapta angered Thoth. This work was not meant for mortals, and so Thoth had all of Nefer-Kapta's family drowned, and the book was returned to its hiding place. Now, there are some other adventures related to the book and those who seek its wisdom, but it doesn't go well for them either. It clearly is a text that is too powerful for a mere human being to attain. Because of the story out of the Egyptian papyri, the contents of the Book of Thoth have been researched and speculated and fictionalized and faked for decades. The instantiation in Mumbo Jumbo is merely one version of this, but there are others. For instance, Aleister Crowley's tarot deck, which I've already mentioned. This wasn't, as one might expect, a statement by Crowley that his cards, a bespoke and yet scholastically sophisticated deck with oftentimes stunning art by Lady Frida Harris, were a replication of the actual Book of Thoth. If one reads the book-length essay that Crowley wrote to accompany this deck, a deck that was first released in a limited run of 200 in 1944, you'll see that Crowley pretty quickly hand-waves away the possibility that the tarot deck is part of the lineage that links back directly to ancient Egypt. He moves right into explaining the relationship between the Kabbalah and the tarot, the Kabbalah being Jewish mysticism with no clear and indisputable ties to ancient Egypt. For a thorough history of the tarot, go back to my feed about a year ago in which I gave a pretty in-depth presentation on the history of the tarot, including the evidence and implication of a connection between the tarot and ancient Egyptian thought. It's not, of course, Crowley that first made this connection. Rather, it became a commonly held belief in the 18th century, a combination of a surge in Egyptomania and an effort to find divine wisdom in these cards which were growing in significance as spiritual tools. The man who can be perhaps most directly blamed or credited with making this connection is a Protestant pastor and Freemason named Antoine Court de Gebien. In the 1780s, he published a 9-volume work that gathered together his various strains of study. It was called, in English, The Primeval World, Analyzed and Compared to the Modern World. This work included 2 chapters on the tarot, one written by Gebien and one written by a man named Louis Fayol, the Comme des Malais. Between these 2 essays, we get many of the preconceived notions one has about the tarot, such as its status as a repository of esoteric and ancient Egyptian wisdom, the association with the gypsies, the pairing of the 22 trumps with the Hebrew alphabet, as well as the state-of-the-art in divinatory practices and esoteric symbolism. Gebien, and I want to stress that this is only one etymology and not one typically agreed upon by scholars, determined that the word tarot came from the Egyptian root words tar, meaning way, and ro, meaning royal, and thus the tarot was the royal path of life. The scholarship of all this is a bit dubious, but nonetheless, Gebien was hugely influential on the line of thinking around the tarot that led to Crowley's deck. Now, I think there's probably a few things from ancient Egypt that survived into the cards, just as there is stuff from ancient Egypt that has likely survived into exoteric Christianity and Judaism, just as the story of Moses leading his people out of Egypt is among the foundational myths of Western culture. But if we're looking for the real Book of Thoth, we have to look past the tarot. There is a very strong candidate, but it's a bit messy and unsatisfying. I'm going to read a bit from a fairly recent work by 2 scholars, Richard Jasnow and Carl Theodor Zozich. It's called The Ancient Egyptian Book of Thoth, a Demotic Discourse on Knowledge and Pendant to the Classical Hermetica. Quote, "We believe our title, The Book of Thoth, is not unsuitable for the composition. It is, admittedly, a term which has been applied to numerous distinct texts. Thoth was indeed a prolific author. According to Manetho, he wrote 36,525 books, although another scholar, Seleucus, maintained it was only 20,000. In any case, our particular Book of Thoth early on assumed alarming proportions. There are now some 18 columns in more or less secure sequence, and several sections are represented by as many as 7 different manuscript witnesses, an uncommon luxury in Egyptian. There are approximately 44 witnesses to the composition, ranging from tiny fragments to lengthy and complete multi-columned papyri. We have identified portions of the Book of Thoth in Berlin, Paris, Vienna, Florence, Copenhagen, and New Haven. The discursive nature of the composition is determined largely by its question and answer format. The Book of Thoth is not a narrative, but a dialogue between a figure we'll call in English the one who loves knowledge, or the one who wishes to learn, and a deity, one who we can call in English he who praises knowledge. We identify this latter with Thoth. While there may be an overall shape to the composition, it conveys the loose character of an encyclopedia. One basic aim of the work seems to be to present different types of useful scribal/theological/scholarly knowledge to the aspiring disciple or reader. As such, the author often moves from point to point in a fashion difficult for us today to discern. Moreover, individual temple scribes may well have changed, expanded, and adapted a core composition according to their own individual needs. This would account for the various versions which we have identified. It may incorporate ritual texts or served the priestly scribes as a reference work on such matters. As may be expected in a composition of this type, it is not always clear just where a given passage is situated in time and space. One has the impression that much of the action is set in the House of Life in connection with specific festivals or events. However, there is little doubt that the constituent elements of the House of Life could be imbued with symbolic force. The author may conceive this institution as reflecting the underworld, or perhaps better, the divine world. Similarly, the author of the Book of Thoth may sometimes employ metaphorical language. The process of attaining mastery of scribal knowledge, for example, may mirror the deceased's striving to attain rebirth. End quote. So, according to the work of Jasnow and Zozich, the Book of Thoth is a discourse between Thoth and another figure that they refer to, and I think the way that they would pronounce it is something like Mai, and as I said, that translates to the one who loves knowledge, or he who wishes to learn. And so it's a dialogue, not unlike the dialogues of Plato or the dialogue contained within the later Hermetic text, the Asclepius. Their project, Jasnow and Zozich, has been to assemble the work from various fragments written in Demotic script, the descendant of hieroglyphic and hieratic Egyptian, which, to a quick glance, might look like Arabic. Now, this Mai character, the one who loves knowledge, is not an entirely ignorant student. He has an ability to demonstrate his knowledge to the gods, not just Thoth, but Khonshu as well. It is possible, based on the insight he brings to the conversation, that he is, in fact, dead, and that this conversation is happening in the underworld. And he certainly seems to be motivated to be initiated into the underworld and to become involved in the eternal struggle between good and evil. Other figures appear in the text as well, such as someone who in English we might call he has judged, namely the one who is upon his back. Okay, crazy name. This guy is sometimes associated with the baboon, like Thoth, and may or may not be Osiris. There's also a mention of the festival of Imhotep, as well as what seems to be a hymn to Imhotep, particularly interesting because Imhotep is actually a historical figure, an Egyptian chancellor and high priest of Ra in the 27th century BC. There's also a bunch of allegorical figures, such as the prophet, the craftsman, the assistant, and others. There's also frequent mention of the aforementioned institution called the House of Life, which Yasnau and Zazic suggest is not only the source of the Book of Thoth, but seems to be a place where scribes were trained, that is, an ancient Egyptian scriptorium, as well as a sacred location for rites, such as one that scholars refer to as preservation of life in the world. Now, this Book of Thoth is comprised of varying styles, including hymns, epithets, anecdotes, analogy, and much of the text is about the act of writing itself, according to Yasnau and Zazic. There are also instances of a range of poetic devices, including deliberate manipulation of meter, varying tenses and modes, parallelism, parable, wordplay, aphorism, and so on. There are sections of the book that are deliberately scholastic or encyclopedic, or as the authors term it, onomastic, that is, passages deliberately intended for the teaching of quasi-scientific information, such as the nature of plants and animals. Like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there's a certain preoccupation with the terrain and geography of the underworld, potentially providing guidance for the many trials that faced Egyptians after their death. Initiation and mysticism are also prominent themes in this Book of Thoth. Yasnau and Zazic see the text as, quote, clearly designed to expedite the disciples' spiritual rebirth and confrontation with the divine, end quote. However, this attribute alone does not really distinguish the book from other works of Egyptian religion, such as the Apuleius or the Karnak priestly initiation texts that have been found. Here's an example, and it's kind of hard to read, so bear with me. Quote, may I see the darkness as a servant of Isin, that I may make a glorification of the secrets of Thoth. May I enter therein, namely the character of all the ibises, that I betake myself to the place of the servants of Thoth. May I see heaven reveals me, and the four corners of the earth to its length. May the Nile flood turn me back, there flow over me, from them, namely the secrets and praise, their sources. My heart said to me, return to it, namely the chamber of darkness, learn its boundary. Effective is the chapel of Ba. Effective is the one who takes possession for himself from the storeroom of the deceased spirits. May he open his throat. May he give praise to it. Many are the names of the chapel of the Ba. May he learn the number of times of calling out the door, a great protector of Mut, the great one of the enchanters. And so on. Now, what a modern reader of this text is unlikely to find, and I did a pretty decent job of scanning through the oftentimes fragmentary and provisional translation. No shade here. What Yasnau and Zazic have done is an impressive feat of scholarship. What you're not probably going to find in here is a whole lot of portable wisdom. There are very few quotable concepts in here that you might take away from the reading as a guidance for your own life. If this is the supposed Book of Thoth, it must keep its secrets to life, the universe, and everything somewhere between or under the words. Now, other researchers have suggested that pertinent aspects of the Book of Thoth have made their way into what is known commonly as the Corpus Hermeticum. This is a collection of Greek writings traditionally attributed to Hermes Trismegistus.
The place to begin, I think, is obviously with the question, who is Hermes Trismegistus? What are we talking about here? I mean, this sounds so incredibly exotic to people. The Renaissance had the concept of what it called the presci theologi. And if my Latin and Greek irritates you, you have to understand you're dealing with a boy from a coal mining town in Colorado. So I do mangle these things. The presci theologi were Orpheus, Moses, and primarily Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus was the primary source, from the point of view of the Renaissance, of this whole mystery tradition. And you recall from last night's lecture that this is based on a misunderstanding. The Renaissance believed that Hermes Trismegistus was older than Moses. But what Hermes Trismegistus is a character who appears in many guises in these Hermetic dialogues. The Hermetic hymns are usually couched in the form of dialogues between Hermes and his son Thoth. And Thoth takes the role of the uninitiated ingenue who is sitting at the feet of the master. And Thoth asks questions. What is the true nature of the world? What is the true nature of man? And Hermes answers. And the general form of these texts, with exceptions, because there are 20 of them, is an intellectual dialogue which builds to an ecstatic revelation, and then in the wake of the ecstatic revelation, there is a hymn of praise to Hermes Trismegistus. Trismegistus means thrice blessed, and is sometimes called Hermes triplex, to distinguish this Hermes from all the other Hermes of early, middle, and late Greek thinking. Hermes is, of course, the messenger god, the god of scribes. The reason this ibis-headed being holding a staff is embossed on the cover of each of these books is because this is how Hermes Trismegistus, Thoth Hermes, was imagined. He was associated with the scribe god of the Egyptian pantheon.
So if the Corpus Hermeticum does contain traces of the Book of Thoth, and thereby we'd have to presume a kind of pencil rubbing, if not a clear image, of the secrets of esoteric Egyptian religion, well, what did Hermes have to say? What were the Hermeticists on about? It's a pretty deep well, and we could spend a couple hours on it here, but I'll just highlight a few of the finer points as I've come to understand them. A Hermeticist is likely to believe that mankind is more like the brothers and sisters of God than the sons and daughters. That mankind, a being in the image of God, has been sent down to earth as God's emissary in the realm of matter to put the earth to order. The precept, as above, so below, which you've probably heard, is also of critical importance, meaning that the realm we live our daily lives within mirrors the divine or spiritual realm. Mirrors will come up again a little later when we get into Voodoo. Per Valentine Tomberg, a Hermeticist is also a kind of iconophile, that is, one for whom symbols actually are a route to truth rather than a means to simplify or obscure it. There's a lot more one could get into with this, and it's a fascinating topic, but let me just drop a little reading from a volume called the Asclepius, often considered a part of the expanded Hermetica.
And although Hermes speaks specifically of Egypt, I would suggest that Egypt is used here as a metaphor for the world and indeed for our world, because this text speaks to the future, and I think it speaks to our time, and it contains a warning, but also a message of hope. Do you know, Asclepius, that Egypt is an image of heaven? Or to speak more exactly, in Egypt, all the operations of the powers which rule and work in heaven are present in the earth below. In fact, it should be said that the whole cosmos dwells in this our land, as in a sanctuary. And yet, since it is fitting that wise men should have knowledge of all events before they come to pass, you must not be left in ignorance of what I will now tell you. There will come a time when it will have been in vain that Egyptians have honored the Godhead with heartfelt piety and service, and all our holy worship will be fruitless and ineffectual. The gods will return from earth to heaven. Egypt will be forsaken, and the land which was once the home of religion will be left desolate, bereft of the presence of its deities. O Egypt, Egypt, of thy religion nothing will remain but an empty tale, which thine own children in time to come will not believe, Nothing will be left but graven words, and only the stones will tell of thy piety. And in that day men will be weary of life, and they will cease to think the universe worthy of reverent wonder and worship. They will no longer love this world around us, this incomparable work of God, this glorious structure which he has built, this sum of good made up of many diverse forms, this instrument whereby the will of God operates in that which he has made, ungrudgingly favoring man's welfare. This combination and accumulation of all the manifold things that call forth the veneration, praise, and love of the beholder. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. No one will raise his eyes to heaven. The pious will be deemed insane, the impious wise. The madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked will be esteemed as good. As for the soul, and the belief that it is immortal by nature, or may hope to attain to immortality, as I have taught you, all this they will mock, and even persuade themselves that it is false. No word of reverence or piety, no utterance worthy of heaven will be heard or believed. And so the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Then will the earth tremble, and the sea bear no ships. Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits. All voices of the gods will be forced into silence. The fruits of the earth will rot. The soil will turn barren, and the very air will sicken with sullen stagnation. All things will be disordered and awry. All good will disappear. But when all this has befallen Asclepius, then God, the creator of all things, will look on that which has come to pass, and will stop the disorder by the counterforce of his will, which is the good. He will call back to the right path those who have gone astray. He will cleanse the world of evil, washing it away with floods, burning it out with the fiercest fire, and expelling it with war and pestilence. And thus he will bring back his world to its former aspect, so that the cosmos will once more be deemed worthy of worship and wondering reverence. And God, the maker and maintainer of the mighty fabric, will be adored by the men of that day with continuous songs of praise and blessing. Such is the new birth of the cosmos. It is a making again of all things good, a holy and awe-inspiring restoration of all nature. And it is wrought inside the process of time by the eternal will of the Creator.
Now, in Mumbo Jumbo, the Book of Thoth is pretty explicitly not any of the texts I've referenced here. But what it does contain is critical to the prolonged, prestige of the book that we see in chapters 52 and 53. And an important connection between the time of the Book of Thoth's writing and our modern day is the life of Moses, for whom Reed presents a pretty radical biography. And of course, Moses is hugely important. In that clip from McKenna that I included above, we see that there is a clear linkage between Moses and Hermes and Thoth and everything that's come up so far. Now, Ishmael Reed is opposed to the monotheistic regime that has presided over so much of Western history, and he in fact traces it through the life of Moses. Moses was, in Reed's depiction, a dedicated atonist who sought to use the Book of Thoth for his own gain. Moses' folly comes when he attempts to perform the ritual music of the Book of Thoth as a kind of one-man band with a captive audience, as opposed to the more free-form groove borne by the carrier wave of Just Grew. In this reimagining of Moses, Ishmael Reed finds himself in good stead. For instance, the writer Zora Neale Hurston, who was a Harlem Renaissance luminary and is mentioned in Mumbo Jumbo. You may have heard of her best-known work, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which I totally recommend, and her anthropological efforts, including her study of Haiti and Voodoo. She wrote a novel called Moses, Man of the Mountain. Part of the plot of this book is that Moses has mastered the magical arts contained within the Book of Thoth, and it is these miracles he performs to liberate the Hebrews from Egypt. Interestingly, Hurston's book, like Mumbo Jumbo, makes a big deal out of Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. Now, I was raised with the Bible stories, but never paid Jethro much attention at all. It turns out that in some schools of thought, Jethro is actually really important. For instance, in the Druze religion, Jethro's name is Shuab, and if we were to translate this into English, it would be something like he who shows the right path. He's in fact their most revered prophet. There remains a shrine in Galilee known in English as Jethro's Tomb, which is probably the most important site in the Druze faith, and it's where they have made their pilgrimages since the 12th century. There is another rearticulation of Moses that is perhaps most important for our purposes here, and that's because it comes from the pen of none other than Sigmund Freud himself, apparently a vicious atonist by Ishmael Reed's lights, and the author, in addition to everything else he wrote, of a little book entitled Moses and Monotheism. The thesis of Moses and monotheism is in some ways very similar to the revision of consensus history given to us by Papa Labah in Mumbo Jumbo. Freud suggests that Moses was in fact not Hebrew, rather he was Egyptian, and as Papa Labah suggests, he was a follower of Aten. And so, in this reading, Moses didn't only make the Hebrews monotheistic, he made them worship an Egyptian god. Now, this isn't entirely a spurious claim. Freud does present a bunch of evidence. One thing he points out is the name Moses itself. He likens it to Ramses, ending in that SES, and an Egyptian figure called Thothmes, ending in just ES. Freud goes on to claim that the Hebrews, not for any particularly nefarious reason, but for perfectly psychological reasons, paired likely with an oral tradition, seem to have turned the Egyptian-born Moses into a Hebrew figure. After all, he is a hero for the Hebrews and a villain for the Egyptians. And so it kind of makes sense that as time goes on and the story gets kind of broken down and distilled, by the end of it, Moses would no longer be an Egyptian. He would be a Hebrew, perhaps the most Hebrew, right? Makes sense to me. Now, Freud did a whole bunch of reading and research and thinking about this topic, and he came up with more than a few implications and areas of research that all serve to justify this line of thinking. Now, the way I see it, Freud is doing a kind of deductive work presented as inductive. I think he had his conclusion first and he went and looked for evidence of it. But he does spend a lot of time thinking through the consequences, both theological and historical, I suppose, if Moses was in fact Egyptian. Because if Moses was Egyptian, then really we need a reason why he would liberate the Jews. And general altruistic compassion might not be enough. I mean, he didn't just open the door to the prison and shoo them out to fend for themselves. Moses became the patriarch of the Jews, their lawgiver, their head of state, and their supreme religious leader. How and why would an Egyptian do this? Here's from Freud. Quote, "A strange fact in the history of the Egyptian religion, which was recognized and appraised relatively late, opens up another point of view. It is still possible that the religion Moses gave to his Jewish people was yet his own, an Egyptian religion, though not the Egyptian one. In the glorious 18th dynasty, when Egypt became for the first time a world power, a young pharaoh ascended to the throne about 1375 BC, who first called himself Amenhotep IV, like his father, but later on changed his name, and not only his name. The king undertook to force upon his subjects a new religion, one contrary to their ancient traditions and to all their familiar habits. It was a strict monotheism, the first attempt of its kind in the history of the world, as far as we know, and religious intolerance, which was foreign to antiquity before this and for long after, was inevitably born with the belief in one God. But Amenhotep's reign lasted only for 17 years. Very soon after his death in 1358, the new religion was swept away and the memory of the heretic king proscribed. From the ruins of his new capital, which he had built and dedicated to his god, and from the inscriptions in the rock tombs belonging to it, we derive the little knowledge we possess of him. Everything we can learn about this remarkable, indeed unique, person is worthy of the greatest interest. Everything new must have its roots in what was before. The origin of Egyptian monotheism can be traced back a fair distance with some certainty. In the school of the priests in the Sun Temple at On, or Heliopolis, tendencies had for some time been at work developing the idea of a universal God and stressing his ethical aspects. Maat, the goddess of truth, order, and justice, was a daughter of the sun god Re. Already under Amenhotep III, the father and predecessor of the reformer, the worship of the sun god was in the ascendant, probably in opposition to the worship of Amun of Thebes, who had become overprominent. An ancient name of the sun god, Aten or Atum, was rediscovered, and in this Aten religion the young king found a movement he had no need to create, but one which he could join." End quote. And so Moses is a follower of this religion, in Freud's word, Atenism. He is a follower of Aten. He was a monotheist in opposition to the polytheism of the pharaoh in charge, and possibly the pharaoh that was his own father.
"Let my people go."
The slaves are mine. Their lives are mine. All that they own is mine. I do not know your God, nor will I let Israel go.
Who are you to make their lives bitter in hard bondage? Man shall be ruled by law, not by the will of other men.
Who is this God that I should let your people go?
Aaron, cast down my staff before Pharaoh, that he may see the power of God. In this you shall know that the Lord is God.
Mother! Mother! He turned his staff into a cobra.
Nothing of his will harm you, my son.
The power of your God is a cheap magician's trick.
Now, monotheism isn't the only connection that Freud sees between Atenism and Judaism. He makes the point that both Judaism and Atenism have a curious lack of concern with the afterlife. In the case of Atenism, this appears to have been a deliberate culture war to stanch the influence of Osiris, the death god. To get Osiris out of the picture, religiously speaking, you have to paper over the Egyptian obsession with dying and what comes after death. There was also apparently a practice of circumcision in Egypt, according to Freud and Herodotus, and Freud claims it simply makes no sense that if Moses were a Hebrew, he would impress this practice on the Hebrews. Why give them a symbol of the very bondage they were attempting to escape? Freud points to an apparent contradiction about circumcision in the Bible to kind of support this argument. Further, he says that the biblical observation that Moses was slow of speech may have merely indicated that he did not speak the language of the Hebrews, or at least did not speak it well, that he was, once again, an Egyptian. Quote, "Well, Moses announced to the populace that he would give a concert with music and songs better than the black mud sound, which was dying rapidly and played only by a few old fools in the hills. He said that this would be a dignified concert and that everyone would have to leave them old nasty-ass animal fetishes and rattlers and all these other flesh pipes back home, and that there would be no savage dancing. Don't be bringing none of that silly shit to my gig," Moses said. "I'm the one." For once, music wouldn't just be as a background to dancing, but he would be a soloist, and no one in the audience would be allowed to play a whistle or beat a drum or rattle a tambourine. The Osirians were furious. They knew this to be an Atenist trick and decided to disrupt the concert. Well, the night of the concert, the people were herded into the concert grounds. Non-attendance was equated with treason. Moses began to play Jethro's songs, but they weren't coming across like the way they had at the old man's fireplace. They sounded flat, weak, deprived of the low-down rhythms that Jethro had brought to them. An applause sign was placed up, and Moses received applause. A man who didn't go along was taken outside and beaten with flails and crooks. From a box seat, Thermuthis and her expatriate friends applauded loudest of all. One Greek said he would return to Greece and announce that Moses sounded even better than Osiris must have sounded himself. Moses then played the songs of Jethro with the words, but his voice sounded feigned, his mimic of Jethro's dialect phony, and at this point some grain was thrown up on the stage and people were imitating snakes by hissing. That corner of the park was beaten until blood streamed down the aisles. Well, during the intermission, Moses went backstage and his Atenist supporters, ass-kissers who traveled with him everywhere he went since his return to Egypt, were drinking beer and told Moses how good he was and began to pat him on the back. Moses knew something was wrong. He was told by one of the ushers that fights were breaking out in the stadium and that they would have to call for the army if the violence got out of control. "Don't worry," Moses said. "I will next do the songs and dances I learned from the work, the sacred book, and that way the people will rejoice and love me and young girls will follow me everywhere." Well, Moses went on stage and began gyrating his hips and singing the words of the Book of Thoth, and a strange thing happened. The ears of the people began to bleed. Some of them charged the stage and tried to get at Moses, but the Atenist thugs beat them back. One Osirian priest could no longer take it. He and several others knew what Moses had learned and knew how it was using him. Moses couldn't understand. Why hadn't the rites and the words and the dances congealed? Why hadn't the contagion broken out? Why weren't people talking in strange tongues and having happy convulsions? End quote. Now, Reed makes interesting use of this term, the black mud sound. Early on in that passage, Ishmael Reed made interesting use of this term, the black mud sound. It's an evocative descriptor, and for me it makes me think of deep, gritty blues from like the southern swamps, juke joint music. But those exact words have another significance. Let me read a bit from an article by the great Gary Lachman. Quote, during a visit to Vienna in 1909, Jung had a conversation with Freud about the new study of parapsychology. Freud dismissed the whole subject as nonsense, something Jung, who had ample experience of it, could not accept. As the conversation grew heated, Jung, who wanted to keep relations with Freud cordial, found it difficult to hold back his feelings. After all, he had been chosen by Freud to inherit his throne, and he had great respect, even love, for his mentor. But Jung also had his own genius and ambitions and found it difficult to toe the party line. Now, as he looked at Freud, he felt his diaphragm glow as if it was becoming red hot. Suddenly, a loud bang exploded in Freud's bookcase, and both men jumped up, afraid it would fall on them. Jung said to Freud, "There, that is an example of a so-called catalytic exteriorization phenomenon." Freud retorted, "Bosh!" Jung hung his head and predicted that another bang would soon follow. When it did, Freud looked at Jung aghast, and from that moment on was mistrustful of him. Jung said the way Freud looked at him, it was, quote, as if I had done something against him. Not long after this, again in Vienna, Jung again visited Freud, and he later recalled a peculiar conversation they had, during which Freud asked Jung to promise that he would never abandon the sexual theory of the origin of neurosis. Freud told Jung that they must, quote, make a dogma of it, an unshakable bulwark. Jung said that Freud spoke in tones in which a father would ask his son to promise that he would go to church every Sunday. When Jung asked Freud why they had to affirm the sexual theories so vigorously and against what they had to make it a bulwark, Freud replied, quote, against the black tide of mud of occultism, end quote. By this time, Jung knew that he could never assert the sexual theory with the same finality as Freud did. He already had reservations about it, but had kept them to himself. This request to collaborate with him on erecting a dogma was a sign that these reservations would soon have to come out. As we know, they did. End quote. Now, was it the occult that Freud was so scared of, or was it polytheism, the old Egyptian gods come streaming back? And what does it mean for the old Egyptian gods to come streaming back? It seems that if we want to get a sense of that, according to Ishmael Reed, we could do much worse than looking to voodoo. Now, one of my favorite things about this book, Mumbo Jumbo, actually is the voodoo. Most times when voodoo shows up in a book or a movie, it's as a vector for malevolent forces entering our world. Demonic possession is a causative factor and a plot that involves a lot of people dying. It's worth noting that even when it is not explicit, even when it is scientized, all zombie movies are downstream of voodoo. In fact, the word zombie itself was first popularized in a book called The Magic Island about Haiti and voodoo by a guy named William Saybrook. And this was a book he was working on at the very time in which Mumbo Jumbo is set. And so, although the timing is not quite right, I like to imagine that in Mumbo Jumbo, when the public is flooding the libraries to find out more about Haiti, they are confronted with a few fairly dry histories and then this book by Saybrook. And I love this setup because Saybrook is one of the great characters of American letters, a guy you simply cannot make up. Here's from a profile in Nouveau magazine. Quote, Saybrook was born in Maryland in 1886. His father was a preacher. His grandfather had been a circuit preacher who rode around on horseback, praising the Lord and nipping from the flask always present in a pocket of his long coat. Willie went to decent schools, earned a master's degree, and got on with a newspaper in Atlanta, despite appearing before the publisher all duded up, sporting a cane and a fake beard. He was hired as a cub reporter and promoted to city editor when, on a slow news day, he jumped out of a balloon wearing a primitive parachute. Saybrook quit the paper, went to Europe to study philosophy, and quit that to bum around Europe for 2 years. When war broke out, Saybrook joined the French army as an ambulance driver, knew Hemingway and E.E. Cummings, and was gassed at Verdun. Returning to the States, he opened an ad agency and gave it up when it started making money. Next, he bought a farm and planted a crop and walked away from it before anything poked out of the ground. He then went to Arabia and produced a book about his adventures there." End quote. The guy would end up writing not only that book about the Arab world, but books about witchcraft, about one of the times he took the cure for alcoholism, about living among the dervishes and the Druze. And he wrote a book called African Ways, in which he depicted himself taking part in cannibalism. Later on, he realized that he'd been misled, and in order to correct what he saw as some kind of ethical balance, he conspired to actually eat part of a human being. Quote, "At the same time, Saybrook didn't like being a liar, so he used one of his contacts at a hospital in Paris to advise him when a choice young person had died. And so it happened, according to Marjorie Worthington, who was there, that Saybrook appeared at a friend's apartment one evening with a pound of flesh from the neck of a newly dead transit worker. He told his friend and her cook that it was goat from Africa. The cook prepared the flesh in various ways, fried, stewed, fricasseed, boiled, all of which Willie Saybrook sampled, taking notes after every bite." End quote. This was on top of being friends with Aleister Crowley and Man Ray, being a pioneer in S&M, being an inspiration to people like William S. Burroughs. Now, after a storied and chaotic life, William Seabrook intentionally overdosed in an institution in Rhinebeck, New York. For our purposes, the crucial work of William Saybrook is this book I mentioned, The Magic Island. It's a kind of travel log that Saybrook researched by spending some number of months in Haiti during that time where the Marines were occupying it in the 1920s. There are a number of chapters that depict the Haitian aristocracy, a proud class of independent Haitians whose sovereignty was nearly as old as that of the United States. He also has this great story about the White King of Gonave. Gonave is this smaller island under the purview of Haiti that was, at the time, even less understood by the outside world. Most Haitians had never gone there and never would. Apparently there was this U.S. military guy deposited there in the 1920s, and he rose to become the de facto authority of this island, pretty much single-handedly. It's a fascinating story, and I assume that it's mostly true. Now, the other thing that Saybrook writes about is voodoo. He indicates that he kind of ingratiated himself into the culture, mostly through a kind of open-handed approach to his hired help and any native Haitians that he came across. And if we believe what he was saying, he was eventually, tentatively, invited into a number of voodoo rituals. Of course, Saybrook's depictions of voodoo and voodoo rituals, if we read more recent retrospectives on his work, they've been called racist, exaggerated, exploitative, exoticizing, and even dangerous. And I suppose, yeah, the work isn't written with the same kind of sensitivity a more contemporary work might, but at the time, it was a very open-minded work, one that approached Haiti and voodoo with, if not exactly parody to American culture, at least with a genuine curiosity and respect. Many critics at the time of the publication, and this was one of the very best-selling nonfiction books that came out in 1929, saw Saybrook as investigating in a manner that, quote, seems to argue for a greater understanding and a greater and finer tolerance, end quote. Now, as I said, this book actually popularized the term zombie. The average American before its publication had never heard the term, never thought of the concept. But in reality, that part of the book is just a single 12-page chapter. In it, Saybrook talks about anecdotal stories he's heard regarding zombies, including a guy who recruited a whole work crew of them to do contract farming in a remote parcel. More unbelievably, Saybrook claims to have encountered an actual zombie while traveling about the country. Quote, "Before finally taking leave of La Gonave, I did see these so-called walking dead men, and I did, in a sense, believe in them and pitied them, indeed, from the bottom of my heart. It was not the next night, though Polynice, true to his promise, rode with me across the plain Mapu to the deserted, silent cane fields where he had hoped to show me zombies laboring. It was not on any night. It was in broad daylight one afternoon when we passed that way again on the lower trail to Pygmy. Polynice reined in his horse and pointed to a rough, stony, terraced slope on which 4 laborers, 3 men and a woman, were chopping the earth with machetes, among straggling cotton stalks, 100 yards distant from the trail. Wait while I go up there, he said, excited because a chance had come to fulfill his promise. I think it is La Mercy with the zombies. If I wave to you, leave your horse and come. Starting up the slope, he shouted to the woman, It is I, Polynice. and when he waved later, I followed. As I clambered up, Polynice was talking to the woman. She had stopped working, a big-boned, hard-faced black girl who regarded us with surly unfriendliness. My first impression of the three supposed zombies who continued dumbly at work was that there was something about them unnatural and strange. They were plodding like brutes, like automatons. Without stooping down, I could not fully see their faces, which were bent expressionless over their work. Polynice touched one of them on the shoulder, motioned him to get up. Obediently, like an animal, he slowly stood erect, and what I saw then, coupled with what I had heard previously, or despite it, came as a rather sickening shock. The eyes were the worst. It was not my imagination. They were, in truth, like the eyes of a dead man, not blind, but staring, unfocused, unseeing. The whole face, for that matter, was bad enough. It was vacant, as if there was nothing behind it. It seemed not only expressionless, but incapable of expression. I had seen so much previously in Haiti that was outside ordinary normal experience that for the flash of a second I had a sickening, almost panicky lapse in which I thought, or rather felt, great God, maybe this stuff is really true. And if it is true, it is rather awful, for it upsets everything. By everything, I meant the natural fixed laws and processes on which all modern human thought and action are based. Then suddenly I remembered, and my mind seized the memory as a man sinking in water clutches a solid plank, the face of a dog I had once seen in the histological laboratory at Columbia. Its entire front brain had been removed in an experimental operation weeks before. It moved about. It was alive, but its eyes were like the eyes I now saw staring. I recovered from my mental panic. I reached out and grasped one of the dangling hands. It was calloused, solid, human. Holding it, I said, "Bonjour, compère?" The zombie stared without responding. The black wench, La Mercy, who was their keeper, now more sullen than ever, pushed me away, saying Negroes' affairs are not for whites. But I had seen enough.
Zombies? Yes, they are my servants. Did you think we could do it alone? In their lifetime, they were my enemies. Ago, the witch doctor, once my master. Secrets I tortured out of him. Bangerda, the swine, swollen with riches. He fought against my spells until the last. Even yet I have trouble hiding. His Excellency Richard, once Minister of the Interior. Garcia, brigand chief. Marquis, captain of gendarmerie. And this is Chauvin, the high executioner, who almost executed me. I took them, just as we will take this one. But what if they regain their souls? They would tear me to pieces. And that, my friend, shall never be.
Now, if Saybrook's account sounds outlandish, it's worth noting that he is far from the only person, nor even the most reputable, to have observed a zombie. None other than Zora Neale Hurston, who I mentioned before, that darling of the Harlem Renaissance, documented her encounter with a zombie while in Haiti. She's best known as a novelist these days, but was also a practicing anthropologist for a time. Here's an excerpt from Black Perspectives magazine. Quote, "On Sunday, November 8th, 1936, Zora Neale Hurston received the exciting news. There was a zombie at the hospital in Gonave. Hurston wasted little time. A week later, she suspended her anthropological research in Port-au-Prince, traveled from the Haitian capital to the northern port city of Gonave, handed her letter of introduction to the hospital's chief of staff, and walked with him into the hospital yard. There the zombie waited. Hurston flinched at its dreadful appearance, its, quote, black face with the dead eyes, and white eyelids looking, quote, as if they had been burned with acid. It was, quote, too much to endure for long. So Hurston snapped some pictures of the zombie, this wreckage, she wrote, and then fled to a more cheerful part of the hospital. There, after sitting down and composing herself, Hurston asked the doctors to explain the terrible spectacle to which she had just borne witness. They eagerly complied. According to the doctors, the zombie was Felicia Felix Mentor, and she was born in Ennery, a village less than 20 miles northeast of Gonave. Along with her husband and son, Felix Mentor lived in her native village until 1907, when she died of some unknown illness. Her husband then remarried and, quote, advanced himself in life. Her, quote, little boy became a man. In short, life in Enery moved on, at least until the past October. That month, a traveler reported seeing a naked woman on the road. Before local officials could act, the mysterious woman showed up at a farm claiming that it belonged to her father. Eventually, the woman's former husband confirmed the unbelievable. He admitted that the woman in such wretched condition was the deceased Felix Mentor, quote, the wife and mother who had died so long ago, end quote. Sounds pretty crazy, of course, but this topic has also been addressed by the contemporary anthropologist Wade Davis in his book The Serpent and the Rainbow, where his investigations into Haitian documentary literature, folklore, and personal testimonies led him to claim that the zombie phenomenon is, or at least was, in fact real, and that, essentially, one can make a zombie by poisoning a person with tetrodotoxin, found in the pufferfish. This poison basically puts them into a vegetable state for a few days. One can then dig them up, and as they're coming to, dose them with a drug like datura to transition them into an extremely impressionable state within which they'll basically do anything you tell them.
The tacit assumption being that people of African descent south of the Sahara had no religion, which of course is ethnographically absurd. Voodoo is simply a fond word from Dahomey that means spirit or God. And voodoo is not a black magic cult. It's simply the distillation of very profound religious ideas that came over during the tragic diaspora of the slavery era that became sown in the fertile soil of the New World. The essence of voodoo is a dynamic relationship between the living and the dead, whereby the living give birth to the dead become the spirits are the multiple expressions of God, but in this quintessentially democratic faith, even the dead must be made to serve the living. To serve the living, they must become manifest. To become manifest, they must respond to the rhythm of the drums, the power of the chant, to come back from beneath the world of the invisibles, to momentarily displace the soul of the living. So for that brief, shining moment of spirit possession, human being and God become one and the same. And that's why the Haitians will say to you, you white people go to church and speak about God, we dance in the temple and become God. And the African moves in and out of their spirit realm with an ease and an impunity that has always astonished the ethnographic observer. And that's precisely why you see these sort of grand theatrical gestures here in Dahomey, or Togo rather, before the fetish, the acolyte in the koko ritual slicing into his skin to show the power of his faith. How can the body be harmed if he indeed is a god? Or more profoundly, in Haiti, voodoo acolytes in a state of trance handling burning embers with impunity, a rather astonishing example of the mind's ability to affect the body that bears it when catalyzed in a state of extreme excitation. You might ask yourself, why did we get this idea that voodoo was evil? Well, there are many reasons. First of all, Haiti was the only successful slave revolt in history, the only independent black country for a century, and a thorn in the side of the imperial age. And what's more, the U.S. Marine Corps occupied Haiti for 20 years early in the 20th century, and everybody above the rank of sergeant got a book contract. And the books had names like Cannibal Cousins, Black Baghdad, Voodoo Fire in Haiti, Puritan in Voodoo Land, the Magic Island, the White King of La Gonave, and all these books were filled with zombies crawling out of the grave to attack people, pins and needles and voodoo dolls that do not exist, and of course children bred for the cauldron. And they gave rise to the RKO movies of the 40s, Night of the Living Dead, Zombies on Broadway, Zombies of the Stratosphere, The White Zombie Slave, and all these crummy films and all this pulp fiction essentially suggested to the American people during the era of Jim Crow, when most of these Marines were from the South, that Haiti could only find redemption through military occupation.
Now, bringing up the subject of voodoo and going right to zombies is a kind of narrow way of looking at things. It's a bit like bringing up Judaism and going right to the golem, or bringing up Christianity and going right to the blood drinking. Without a lot of context, it's really pretty salacious. But in another way, it's actually quite relevant to Mumbo Jumbo, because a key aspect of the story that Ishmael Reed is telling us is the attempt by Hinkle von Vampton to create what he calls the talking android, who will, quote, work within the Negro, who seems to be its classical host, to drive it out, categorize it, analyze it, expel it, say it, blot just grew, a speaking skull they can use any way they want, a rapping antibiotic who will abort it from the American womb to which it clings like a stubborn fetus, end quote. This strikes me as not unlike a zombie, really. Of course, Hinkle von Vampton is not a voodoo practitioner, but for all anyone might say that the dark magic associated with Haiti, zombies and voodoo dolls, and maybe the sacrifice of animals and demonic possession, as much as one might say that this stuff is not representative of voodoo, it's hard to argue that, at least anecdotally, they seem to live in the same place. I wanted to look into this a bit more, and there seemed no better topic for a Madness episode on Mumbo Jumbo than to give you guys an extensive look into voodoo. Now, my references for this are a little bit of the William Saybrook book, The Magic Island, that I've already mentioned, along with the exhaustive volume, The Divine Horseman by Maya Deren, and of course a variety of other articles and videos and things. I want to start here with some stuff out of Maya Deren's book. Now, if you're not familiar with Maya Deren, she is one of the most fascinating artists of the 20th century, in my estimation. You can check out an in-depth episode on her life and work in the Art of Darkness archive, along with an episode on Zora Neale Hurston as well. But here I'll lay it out fairly simply. Maya Deren was a refugee of pogroms during the Russian Civil War. Her family fled to the United States, where she became a major figure in avant-garde film. Check out Meshes of the Afternoon or At Land if you're curious, and eventually became enamored with Haiti and voodoo, undergoing all of the rites and communing with the Loas, and under the guidance of no less than Joseph Campbell, writing this book on voodoo. There's a lot more to her life than that, but I'll leave it more or less there for now. Before I get too deep into the voodoo, I want to get ahead of a potential criticism, mostly because I don't want anybody to think this isn't something I haven't considered. You could criticize this little presentation I've put together for using sources written by Europeans and Americans instead of Haitians and natives. But I think actually that in some sense, these might be the best entry point for a person like me. Someone from my culture is going to better be able to paint a picture of that culture than perhaps somebody from inside of it, right? You take a kind of fish out of water person, that's who I am, wandering into voodoo stuff, so who better to explore the topic with? In addition to this, and perhaps you had a different read of Mumbo Jumbo than I did, but I didn't actually find Ishmael Reed to be a great tour guide to actually understanding this culture, either anthropologically, technically, or religiously. It is important to note that Saybrook apparently was also initiated to some degree in the voodoo mysteries, and that Maya Deren was definitely initiated. She was even apparently ridden by one of the Loas, and apparently even brought the power of one back with her to the United States, if one is to believe the testimony of her friends. To get us from zombies into a little bit more sophisticated conversation about what voodoo actually is, I'm going to start with what Maya Deren had to say about possession. Quote, here's from Maya Deren, quote, like all religions, voodoo is built on certain basic premises. Briefly, it promises that man has a material body animated by an esprit, the soul, spirit, psyche of the body. This soul may achieve, by stages elaborated in the discussion immediately following, the status of a loa, a divinity, and become the archetypal representative of some natural or moral principle. As such, it has the power to displace temporarily the spirit of a living person and become the animating force of his physical body. This psychic phenomenon is known as possession. The actions and utterances of the possessed person are not the expression of the individual, but are the readily identifiable manifestations of the particular loa or archetypal principle. Since it is by such manifestations that the divinities of the pantheon make known their instructions and desires and exercise their authority, this phenomenon is basic to voodoo, occurs frequently, and is normal both to the religion and to the Haitians. In fact, the Haitian would find it abnormal if it should suddenly cease to occur. The special power of the loa is that of becoming manifest in a living form. Under certain well-defined and ritualistically determined conditions, the loa may temporarily displace the spirit of a living person and become the animating force of that physical body. This we know as possession. In the terminology of voodoo, it is said that the loa mounts a person, or that a person is mounted by the loa. The metaphor is drawn from a horse and his rider, and the actions and events which result are the expression of the will of the rider. Since the conscious self of the possessed person is meanwhile absent, he cannot and does not remember the events. He is not responsible, either for good or for bad, and he cannot, as a person, himself benefit from that possession. The function and purpose of such divine manifestation is the reassurance and the instruction of the community. The complete process can be understood as a closed chain circling life and death. The power of the loa to become manifest in living matter marks their final mastery of matter. End quote. Because of the depth of this communion, really, voodoo is a kind of Gnostic religion by the dictionary and not doctrinal definition of Gnostic. It is a faith based around having actual experience with what they call loas, what people in other cultures might call spirits of the dead, or gods, or angels, or demons. But what are these loas exactly? Well, many of them have been around for quite a long time. Some scholars will say that voodoo practitioners really understand that all of the loas are merely different faces of Bandyi, the supreme creator. The older loas tend to be more significant, to have a domain or several of them, not unlike the gods of the Greeks. So Papa Legba is the master of communication and the crossroads, something of a trickster, like Hermes Trismegistus. He is often depicted as a wise old man smoking a pipe and walking with a cane. Agwe, the loa that possesses Benoit Batcherville in Mumbo Jumbo, rules the sea and aquatic plants. He is sometimes represented wearing a naval uniform. The loa they call Dambala, the namesake of one of Nina Simone's very best songs, rules fertility and creation and is often considered chief loa. He is associated with the serpent and the cosmic rainbow. In fact, there are well over 1,000 of these loas with a steep hierarchy of power and influence. And one could not name all of the loas if they tried, for voodoo simply does not document things in this way. There is no centralized authority in voodoo. A Hungan gets his title on his own merits and his effectiveness in his community. They do not read from a book that lays out the doctrine. And yet there is a kind of consistency of practice, and there are clear lineages of Hungans and Mambos. It's an oral culture and a ritual culture. And yet, if one looks closely enough, they can see that the central features of the religion are, in fact, quite old. Quote, according to Milo Rigaud, there must have been among the Africans transported to the New World a number of those who, in their villages, had been Hungans, or spirit masters, and it would have been these, then, who maintained the continuity of the esoteric doctrine. The role of the loa named Legba, for example, corresponds to that of Hermes in the Hellenistic mysteries, so many of their symbols being identical that the analogies cannot be dismissed, either as incidental or as a consequence of what anthropologists term convergence. They comprise the total image of the god and are, furthermore, symbolically consistent, whether as rendered in the rites and myths or as interpreted by qualified Hungans, with a sufficient number of whom Milo Rigaud has been for years well acquainted on the best of terms. In any case, no matter what the explanation may be, the parallels between the myths and cults of contemporary Haiti and those not only of 17th century Africa, but also of antiquity, are undeniable and abundant. That's actually a quote by Joseph Campbell, the man who popularized the notion of the hero's journey, and he wrote that book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. He wrote the intro to Maya Deren's book, The Divine Horseman. The only connection that I see Joseph Campbell really missing here in this brief excerpt is the Native American influence on voodoo. The general thinking now is that the African diaspora brought a part of voodoo that is referred to as Rada, and Rada is a family of loa that are generally more benevolent and chill. Here in the Western Hemisphere were created or found the Petro-Loa, more aggressive and intense and kind of inflamed by the violence of the colonial experience. I'm talking about these both as if they are the same thing, but it is interesting to note, I think, the level of syncretism going on here, right? So far we've got apparently Hellenistic mysteries merging with Native American lore through the kind of vector of a pre-slavery African religion.
The same process that led to new spirits being created in South America with no antecedents in Africa led to ragtime here. Read an early anthology by James Willard Johnson. He said nobody knows how ragtime came about. It just grew. You see, that's why I have just grew in Mumbo Jumbo as being a spontaneous rising. Hoodoo is always changing and it's always adapting, and it reminds you of the early white religions, which were very very similar to hoodoo. When Augustus, for example, now this is the way hoodoo works. When Augustus heard that there was a new god, Jehovah, he said, well, let's put him in the palace. We worship him too. Who cares, Right. Put us more the merrier. That's where we are. Any amount of spirits, any amount of art forms. We're very tolerant.
Now, the means by which a loa is created is kind of interesting, I think. I'm going to boil this way, way down without going deeply into the specific flavor of dualism enacted in voodoo, the idiosyncratic relationship between matter and spirit. Apparently in voodoo, theoretically, anyone could become a loa. Sometime after a person dies, there is a ritual that in English we would call something like reclaiming the dead. During this ritual, it is believed that the spirit of the dead enter a special vessel called a govee. Remember, Ishmael Reed refers to the city of New Orleans itself as a govee. Now, from this govee, the hungan will be possessed by the ancestor, and in a bit of either channeling or old-school spiritualist legerdemain, the hungan or mambo will speak to the dead's loved ones. Now, just about everybody except for outcasts are recalled in this manner at least once, but if you are recalled many times, if your memory grows in significance over a very long period of time, your soul will gradually transcend from its status as a vanishing and free-floating denizen of the invisible into a sentient personality that can be drawn down into any ritual. You become a Loa. Though it takes a long time, and per Maya Deren, there is no Loa that can be remembered as a human being. A big part of voodoo practice is keeping these Loas alive and friendly. The idea is that the dead are servants to the living, but that means they kind of have to be kept happy. We see this practice in Mumbo Jumbo. If you remember it's his assistant Erline's negligence about feeding the Loas that ultimately leads to the seductive Loa Erzline breaking out and taking possession of her. Now, from what I've read, this isn't particularly consistent with voodoo practice, but nonetheless. Now, one thing that I think is interesting is that this concept of the Loa is a primary reason why Catholicism was able to kind of integrate into voodoo, despite the fact that the Catholic Church doesn't really care for this, neither did the Catholic slaveholders and Catholic rulers of the island. Haiti is, after all, officially a Catholic country to this day, though it's understood that many, many Haitians hold on to at least the superstitions around voodoo, even if they are not practitioners in the ritual. See, to the untrained eye, the saints of the church and the Loas are not all that different. In voodoo, many Catholic saints, in fact, have been permanently assigned to Loas. Again, not all that dissimilar from how the Roman gods were overlaid onto those of the Greeks. But the conflation of Loa and saint for those who practice voodoo, it's not only this sort of structural similarity they see with Christianity, it has to do with the symbols as well. The Christian cross for believers in voodoo lays very neatly on an old symbol of their own, the crossroads, of which Papa Legba is the master, and which they also associate with the mirror. Quote, "The metaphor for the mirror's depth is the crossroads. The symbol is the cross. For the Haitian, this figure is not only symbolic of the totality of the Earth's surface as comprehended in the extension of the cardinal points on a horizontal plane, it is, above all, a figure for the intersection of the horizontal plane, which is this mortal world, by the vertical plane, the metaphysical axis, which plunges into the mirror. The crossroads, then, is the point of access to the world of the invisibles, which is the soul of the cosmos, the source of life force, the cosmic memory, and the cosmic wisdom. As the daily life of a man depends upon his constant communication with his own soul, his own memory, intelligence, imagination, and invention, so the Haitian, individually and collectively, would communicate and draw upon the world of the invisibles. For this reason, the crossroads is the most important of all ritual figures. Where other cultures might conceive of the physical and the metaphysical as, at best, a parallelism, a necessarily irreconcilable dualism, the Haitian peasant resolves the relationship in the figure of right angles. The foot of this vertical plane rests in the waters of the abyss, the source of all life. Here is Africa, the legendary place of racial origin. Here, on the island below the sea, the Loa have their permanent residence, their primal location." End quote. Now, okay, we've heard Joseph Campbell refer to voodoo as being a proper descendant of ancient Western religions, and Maya Deren has an entire book dedicated to the beauty and intricacy of the religion. So where does this connection to kind of dark magic come in? Things like voodoo dolls and zombies. Well, the way that I read Maya Deren's work is that the reason that this association is there to Western eyes is because the Bokor, the guy who practices dark magic, is operating within the same cosmological system as the decent, faithful believer in voodoo. See, according to her, a faithful Hungan or Mambo would never use magic or sorcery in the petty ways of a Bokor. They wouldn't use their knowledge instrumentally for financial gain or for revenge, right? But in the minds of voodoo practitioners, there is something like a battle between good and evil happening on the island. And the Hungans and the Mambos need to know magic for the purpose of defending themselves and the innocent from the dark arts. Reading Maya Deren, it seems like we in the West have sort of twinned the two halves of voodoo under one description, And that, when one looks closely, seems about as fair as saying that because the crucifix is effective against Dracula, that means vampirism is part of Christianity. It's probably more reasonable to say that the Hungan, like Papa Laba in Mumbo Jumbo, is doing something akin to white magic. Of course, I'm not necessarily asserting that anything in this belief system is true. I just like getting into the details. If we're doing white magic, then what's the point of possession? Because from the Christian world's eyes, possession brings up the idea of, demonic possession, right? The Exorcist, whole reams of airport thrillers about people being taken over by demons. Well, according to Maya Deren, the point in voodoo of being possessed, of being mounted by a loa, isn't to become slave to dark forces, but to glean reassurance and guidance from the invisible world. At the end of her book, The Divine Horseman, she appends this mostly scholarly work with a chapter called The White Darkness, which recounts her own experience of possession. I'm going to read some of this with the setup that, as I start here, Maya has already been in the ritual for an extended period of time. There have been riots on the drums, singing, dancing, gestures. She has kissed a ritual saber. A bunch of stuff has happened. It's been building up until she has a moment where, still conscious, she feels her body sort of being moved for her. Not dissimilar, but more disquieting than, say, catching a rhythm at the club when you've had a few drinks. But then, as the ritual gathers in intensity, the real possession begins. Quote, "As sometimes in dreams, so here I can observe myself, can note with pleasure how the full hem of my white skirt plays with the rhythms, can watch as if in a mirror how the smile begins with a softening of the lips, spreads imperceptibly into a radiance which surely is lovelier than any I have ever seen. It is when I turn as if to a neighbor to say, 'Look, see how lovely that is,' and see that the others are removed to a distance, withdrawn to a circle which is already watching, that I realize, like a shaft of terror struck through me, that it is no longer myself whom I watch. Yet it is myself, for as that terror strikes, we too are made one again, joined by and upon the point of the left leg, which is as if rooted to the earth. Now there is only terror. This is it. Resting upon that leg, I feel a strange numbness enter it from the earth itself and mount within the very marrow of the bone as slowly and richly as sap might mount the trunk of a tree. I say numbness, but that is inaccurate. To be precise, I must say what, even to me, is pure recollection, but not otherwise conceivable. I must call it a white darkness, its whiteness a glory and its darkness terror. It is the terror which has the greater force, and with a supreme effort, I wrench the leg loose. I must keep moving, and pick up the dancing rhythm of the drums as something to grasp at, something to keep my feet from resting upon the dangerous earth. No sooner do I settle into the succor of this support than my sense of self doubles again, as in a mirror, separates to both sides of an invisible threshold, except that now the vision of the one who watches flickers, the lids flutter, the gaps between moments of sight growing greater, wider. I see the dancing one here and next in a different place, facing another direction, and whatever lie between the moments is lost, utterly lost. I feel that the gaps will spread and widen, and that I will, myself, be altogether lost in that dead space, in that dead time. With a great blow, the drum unites us once more upon the point of the left leg. The white darkness starts to shoot up. I wrench my foot free, but the effort catapults me across what seems a vast distance, and come to rest upon a firmness of arms and bodies which would hold me up. But these have voices, great, insistent singing voices, whose sound would smother me. With every muscle, I pull loose and again plunge across a vast space, and once more am no sooner poised and balanced than my leg roots. So it goes, the leg fixed, then wrenched loose, the long fall across the space, the rooting of the leg again, for how long, how many times I cannot know. My skull is a drum. Each great beat drives that leg like the point of a stake into the ground. The singing is at my very ear, inside my head. This sound will drown me. Why don't they stop? Why don't they stop? I cannot wrench the leg free. I am caught in this cylinder, this well of sound. There is nothing anywhere except this. There is no way out. The white darkness moves up the veins of my leg like a swift tide rising, is a great force which I cannot sustain or contain, which surely will burst my skin. It is too much, too bright, too white for me. This is its darkness. Mercy! I scream within me. I hear it echoed by the voices, shrill and unearthly. Urzulai! The bright darkness floods up through my body, reaches my head, engulfs me. I'm sucked down and exploded upward at once. That is all. If the anti-plague of Jess Groove from Mumbo Jumbo were to show up today, I think people would say it's some sort of contagious psychogenic compulsion, maybe a bacteria or a virus. Certainly wouldn't think of it as demons or a sentient groove searching for its source text. In some contexts, it might even be considered a moral outrage requiring the intervention of the church and the law.
Well, I just wanted to say a few words about this motion so that you wouldn't think that we were encouraging destruction with this idea. From the oldest of times, people danced for a number of reasons. They danced in prayer, or so that their crops would be plentiful, or so their hunt would be good. And they danced to stay physically fit and show their community spirit. And they danced to celebrate. And that is the dancing that we're talking about. Yeah. Aren't we told in Psalm 149? Praise ye the Lord. Sing unto the Lord a new song. Let them praise his name in the dance.
Amen. Amen.
And it was King David. King David, who we read about in Samuel. And what did David do? What did David do? What did David do? David danced before the Lord with all his might. Leaping and dancing before the Lord. Leaping and dancing. And Ecclesiastes assures us that there is a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to laugh and a time to weep. A time to mourn. And there is a time to dance.
People might even call back to something like the dancing epidemics of the Middle Ages, perhaps an even better analog for the outward symptomology of Jess Groove than even the jazz craze of the 20th century. It's likely that you've heard of the most famous case, that's the dancing plague of 1518. This is a historically verified event that took place in Strasbourg when two women, one Frau Trophea and her daughter Fraulein Emma Gotz, began to dance in the street. The story goes that there was no musical accompaniment whatsoever, and there perhaps was no joy on their faces either, at least by the end. Within a few days, they were joined by 30 other dancers, some of whom, according to a 2018 article by Ned Pennant-Rea, quote, danced so monomaniacally that only death would have the power to intervene, end quote. The first dancer, Frau Trophea, apparently kept this up for at least a week, moving in a spasmodic, convulsive sort of manner. Their arms would flail around, their eyes, according to some witnesses, were expressionless. Eventually, they would have a heart attack or collapse from hunger and thirst. And this went on for a couple months, from July to September, with dozens, if not hundreds of people dancing to their literal deaths. There have been a lot of theories about what this dancing plague actually was, with most people at the time believing it to be a punishment from Saint Vitus. Some have suggested that it was ergot poisoning, also known as Saint Anthony's fire. This comes from a fungus called ergot that historically has infected wheat and other grains and led to hallucinations and painful, convulsive deaths. But not enough of the symptoms of the dancing plague seem to square. There is, in the medical literature, an official diagnosable syndrome called Sydenham's chorea, which shares many of the symptoms of the dancing plague of 1518, such as gesticulations and a lack of control and sudden jerking movements. This is something that a small number of people afflicted with rheumatic fever may demonstrate, but while some of the symptomology may be the same as what the dancers in Strasbourg demonstrated, it's considered unlikely that such a condition would break out suddenly in large numbers. What's even weirder about this story is that the dancing plague of 1518 is not an isolated incident. It's just the most prevalent occurrence of what seems to be a mass psychogenic affliction that haunted distant corners of Europe for hundreds of years. Though there have been few, if any, instances in living memory, we can still catch a faint echo of the phenomenon in what is called tarantella, which is a genre of southern Italian folk songs and the accompanying dances. In the province of Taranto, possibly starting as early as the 11th century, there was a recurrence in this tendency of people to fall into a kind of dancing mania, referred to in the literature as tarantism. You may think that root word is familiar, and it is. What we call the wolf spider was originally called the tarantula, named after this same region. And further, the historical explanation for tarantism, this manic, compulsive form of dancing, was thought to have been the bite of the wolf spider. However it came to be, some scholars have proposed that tarantism was actually the survival of ancient Dionysic rites, manic, hysterical dancing becoming its own semi-permanent cultural form. Whether there's demonic possession or an ancient ritual or a spider bite, many people at the time thought that the cure was to dance it out, which likely was not the case and probably even exacerbated the issue. What's interesting, though, is that this phenomenon of tarantism evolved eventually from this sort of symptomatic agitation of the sufferer of agitation into a kind of courtship dance, graceful and elegant, but short in duration. In most places, though, the dancing mania has been an unsettling, traumatic, and sometimes lethal affliction. Some people, in searching for an explanation, have sought links to the even darker specter that haunted Europe at this time. Here's an 1832 book entitled The Black Death and the Dancing Mania. Quote, "The effects of the Black Death had not yet subsided, and the graves of millions of its victims were scarcely closed, when a strange delusion arose in Germany, which took possession of the minds of men, and, in spite of the divinity of our nature, hurried away body and soul into the magic circle of hellish superstition. It was a convulsion which, in the most extraordinary manner, infuriated the human frame, and excited the astonishment of contemporaries for more than 2 centuries, since which time it has never reappeared. It was called the Dance of St. John, or of St. Vitus, on account of the bacchantic leaps by which it was characterized, and which gave to those affected, whilst performing their wild dance and screaming and foaming with fury, all the appearance of persons possessed. It did not remain confined to particular localities, but was propagated by the sight of the sufferers, like a demoniacal epidemic, over the whole of Germany and the neighboring countries to the northwest, which were already prepared for its reception by the prevailing opinions of the time. So early as the year 1374, assemblages of men and women were seen at Aix-la-Chapelle, who came out of Germany, and who, united by one common delusion, exhibited to the public both in the streets and in the churches the following strange spectacle. They formed circles hand in hand, and appearing to have lost all control over their senses, continued dancing, regardless of the bystanders, for hours together in wild delirium, until at length they fell to the ground in a state of exhaustion. They then complained of extreme oppression and groaned as if in the agonies of death, until they were swathed in cloths bound tightly round their waists, upon which they again recovered and remained free from complaint until the next attack. This practice of swathing was resorted to on account of the tympany which followed these spasmodic ravings, but the bystanders frequently relieved patients in a less artificial manner by thumping and trampling upon the parts affected. While dancing, they neither saw nor heard, being insensible to external impressions through the senses, but were haunted by visions, their fancies conjuring up spirits whose names they shrieked out, and some of them afterwards asserted that they felt as if they had been immersed in a stream of blood, which obliged them to leap so high. Others, during the paroxysm, saw the heavens open and the Savior enthroned with the Virgin Mary, according as the religious notions of the age were strangely and variously reflected in their imaginations. Where the disease was completely developed, the attack commenced with epileptic convulsions. Those affected fell to the ground senseless, panting and laboring for breath. They foamed at the mouth, and suddenly springing up began their dance amidst strange contortions. Yet the malady doubtless made its appearance very variously, and was modified by temporary or local circumstances, whereof non-medical contemporaries but imperfectly noted the essential particulars, accustomed as they were to confound their observations of natural events with their notions of the world of spirits." End quote. Justice Hecker, the author of that passage and the book comes from, goes on to recount outbreaks in Cologne and in Metz, and then in the 15th century in various towns in Belgium and the Lower Rhine. As he searches wider and older in the literature, he finds documentation of instances in Erfurt in 1237, when as many as 100 children danced down the road to Arnstadt. In 1278, as many as 20 manic dancers mobbed on a bridge in Utrecht, so many that the bridge collapsed and all were drowned. In an instance in 1027 near Bernburg, 18 peasants apparently disturbed church service with their brawling and dancing on Christmas Eve. The priests cursed them for a year, and as Hecker puts it, quote, "This curse is stated to have been completely fulfilled, so that the unfortunate sufferers at length sank knee-deep into the earth and remained the whole time without nourishment, until they were finally released by the intercession of 2 pious bishops. It is said that, upon this, they fell into a deep sleep, which lasted 3 days, and that 4 of them died, the rest continuing to suffer all their lives from a trembling of their limbs." Of course, much attention is paid by Justice Hecker to the phenomenon of Italian tarantism, which I've already kind of mentioned, and he tells the story of a Capuchin friar in that territory whose dancing fits while the tarantella music was played were of such intensity that they brought on a visit from the cardinal. His response to the cardinal's attire, a deep scarlet red, was anecdotal of a less reported but still curious symptom, a frenzied lust for certain colors and an animalistic aversion to others. Similarly, some sufferers of the dancing hysteria generally, and tarantism more specifically, had an intense longing for the sea, a symptom which is still lightly present in a couple of the tunes in the Tarantella songbook. It was our old friend Paracelsus who first attempted to get scientific about what was then termed St. Vitus's dance. He broke it down into 3 types, that which arises from the imagination, that which comes from lust, and that which is more, I suppose, biological in nature. He had a strange notion that certain vessels in the body fell under the sway of their own internal pruriency, leading to a kind of lustful laughter of the blood. This latter version he likely considered combined with a kind of laughing hysteria, which, though milder than the dancing mania, was fairly widespread at the time. Quote, "However, it grew every year more rare, so that at the beginning of the 17th century it was observed only occasionally in its ancient form. Thus, in the spring of the year 1623, G. Horst saw some women who annually performed a pilgrimage to St. Vitus's chapel at Dreffelhausen, near Weissenstein, in the territory of Ulm, that they might wait for their dancing fit there in the same manner as those in the Bresgau did, according to Schenk's account. They were not satisfied, however, with a dance of 3 hours' duration, but continued day and night in a state of mental aberration, like persons in an ecstasy, until they fell exhausted to the ground. And when they came to themselves again, they felt relieved from a distressing uneasiness and painful sensation of weight in their bodies, of which they had complained for several days prior to St. Vitus's day. After this commotion they remained well for the whole year, and such was their faith in the protecting power of the saint that one of them had visited the shrine at Dreffelhausen more than 20 times, and another had already kept the saint's day for the 32nd time at this sacred station." End quote. But Paracelsus did not have access to the volumes of scientific investigation that took place after his own time, or the range of documentary evidence afforded to Hecker. This would all include the work of Giorgio Baglivi, a 17th century Italian physician considered to be one of the greatest doctors of his generation, and a man who earned his doctorate with a dissertation on tarantism. But by this time, the phenomenon was already in decline, which, when you think about it, is just as curious as its emergence. If it's a communicable disease transmitted by spider bite or other means, did it taper off and vanish because we developed an immunity? Because the bug carried by the bug somehow died out? Something else? And if it wasn't caused by a virus or bacteria, well, what did cause it? According to Justice Hecker, it was a man named Serao the Neapolitan, a person I could find no other reference to outside of Hecker's book, who determined that dancing mania was best considered as a marked form of melancholia, a thing that is merely in one's head. Of course, we now know that just because something is merely in your head does not mean it is an affliction any less profound than a missing leg. However, Hecker notes with curiosity that, quote, "by shaking the already vacillating belief in this disorder, he is said to have actually succeeded in rendering it less frequent," end quote. That is, the dancing hysteria is some kind of meme, at least in part, and by pointing out the many frauds, the many people who became willing dancing maniacs for reasons no less scrutable than the reason they might wear the same style of clothes they've seen on friends and neighbors, that it actually diluted the overall potency of the thing. This goes along with the notion presented within this volume by Hecker that the dancing mania is in many ways a cultural phenomenon or a sociological phenomenon, as we moderns now take for granted. He says that the same thing would not have occurred at a different time in the same place, and that one could not assume due to its occurrence in Europe that it would take place at any other time in any other place. But then again, this certainly does not preclude a similar hysteria from cropping up elsewhere. Just because the Jess groove faded out in one time and place does not mean it could not pop up somewhere else, anywhere else, some other time, any other time. And it should be noted that in Hecker's work, he gives hints that a malevolent version of Jess Grue is perhaps always bubbling just beneath the surface. Both the St. Vitus's dance and Tarantism belong to the age in which they appeared. They could not have existed under the same latitude at any other epoch, for at no other period were the circumstances which prepared the way for them combined in a similar relation to each other, and the mental as well as corporeal temperaments of nations, which depend upon causes such as we have stated, are as little capable of renewal as the different stages of life in individuals. This gives so much the more importance to a disease but cursory alluded to in the foregoing pages, which exists in Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, and which nearly resembles the original mania of the St. John's dancers, inasmuch as it exhibits a perfectly similar ecstasy with the same violent effect in the nerves of motion. It occurs most frequently in the Tigre community, being thence called Tigratir, and is probably the same malady which is called in Ethiopian language Asteragaza. On this subject we will introduce the testimony of Nathaniel Pierce, an eyewitness who resided 9 years in Abyssinia. The Tigratir, he says, is more common among the women than among the men. It seizes the body as with a violent fever, and from that turns to a lingering sickness which reduces the patients to skeletons, and often kills them if their relations cannot procure the proper remedy. During the sickness, their speech is changed to a kind of stuttering which no one can understand but those afflicted with the same disorder. When the relations find the malady to be the real Tigratir, they join together to defray the expense of curing it. The first remedy they in general attempt is to procure the assistance of a learned tofter who reads the Gospel of St. John and drenches the patient with cold water daily for the space of 7 days, an application that very often proves fatal. The most effectual cure, though far more expensive than the former, is as follows. The relations hire for a certain sum of money a band of trumpeters, drummers, and fifers, and buy a quantity of liquor. Then all the young men and women of the place assemble at the patient's house to perform the following most extraordinary ceremony. He goes on to explain a little bit about this ceremony, and I'm not going to read it in its entirety, though I will say it's not dramatically different from what I've read about some voodoo ceremonies in the work of Maya Deeren and William Saybrook. Now, the easiest thing to say about the dancing plagues, whatever we want to call them, Jess Grue, dancing mania, choreomania, tarantism, astergaza, is to say that it's just something that happens to the human animal, that there are psychological contagions just as potent and in some cases just as deadly as viruses. The dancing form is perhaps the most unsettling. There's a twisted irony that this joyful outburst of sensual and rhythmic energy can be turned into a thing that drags us into a private kind of hell. But it's not really any worse than other species of mass hysteria or psychogenic affliction. Take, for instance, the biting nuns phenomenon that popped up across a number of European convents in the 15th century. This is exactly what it sounds like, and it started when an individual nun in a German convent took to biting her companions. Rather than the other nuns slapping some sense into her, one by one they began to bite each other, and then somehow the compulsion leapt to another convent, and then another. It turns out that convents apparently, at least in the past, have been particularly prone to these kinds of hysterias and psychological contagion. In addition to the biting nuns, there is a well-documented 1491 case of an outbreak of meowing at a convent in France. Yeah, meowing like cats. Another nunnery in Würzburg, Germany, 1749, was plagued by an epidemic of screaming.
Wake up! What is it? It's Sister Ruth! Stop her! She's gone mad! Oh, it's my fault! It's all my fault!
can't stop mad people. You should leave them alone.
She may kill herself.
If she's really mad, that won't matter.
Quick, all of you, search the house. We must stop her. Sister Ruth! Sister Ruth! Sister Ruth! We must get lanterns. Sister Ruth!
In the modern day, we periodically have instances of similar hysterias. Outbreaks of laughing fits at a school in Tanzania in 1962, a fainting epidemic at another school in the West Bank in the 1980s, an internet-promulgated contagion of Tourette's-like tics just a few years ago in the States, and a plague of twitching at an American high school in 2007 that was variously blamed on lead paint, carbon dioxide in a photography classroom, and some kind of adverse combination of drugs and raging hormones. But sometimes a very different kind of mass hysteria pops up, a sort of mimetic infection that doesn't change so much how people behave, but what they see and believe. My favorite instance of this is a case called the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. This took place in Mattoon, Illinois in the 1940s. It began with some anomalous reports of people waking up to the smell of gas, paired with symptoms like vomiting, fatigue, and temporary paralysis. Then a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Bert Kearney, reported seeing a tall, thin man dressed in dark clothes with a tight-fitting cap outside their home. Very soon, other people reported seeing this figure, oftentimes using one of those old-school pesticide sprayers called a flit gun. You've seen them in Warner Brothers cartoons, to pump gas into their homes. All in all, there were dozens of reports of attacks by the Mad Gasser, and despite skepticism from the local police, the FBI was called in. Eventually, a public announcement was made by authorities that they believed this to be just a sequence of explicable events, exacerbated by public fear and the anxiety felt by women in the community, many of whom were alone in their homes while their husbands were off fighting World War II. Reports of the Mad Gasser then rapidly dropped off. More recent, some of you might remember the 2016 clown sightings in South Carolina. And just a couple weeks ago, there was an outbreak of Bigfoot sightings in Ohio. Not saying those weren't real, but maybe there is another explanation. Point is, to all of this, that the people who were experiencing these things, to them, it was not hysteria. To them, the need to dance or the clown lurking in the woods outside of their home was very real. It forces me to think, if there was a hysteria with which all of us, hell, even a narrow majority, were afflicted, then how could we ever distinguish our visions and gesticulations from reality? So that's it. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, remember that premium subscribers on Substack and Patreon get access to an episode like this just about every month, plus the archive, early access to guest episodes, and access to monthly AMAs. Also, in 2026, if you have a U.S. postal address and sign up for a year subscription, you'll get a special autographed edition of my new novel, The Earthen Dark, in the mail. This includes 2 hand-edited manuscript pages of early drafts and a 1-card tarot reading. Take care out there, and I'll see you on the next one.